Okay, we're going to move forward with the report from the Covington Implementation Committee. So I'll ask Ms. Cooper-Comas and Dr. Bakewell-Sachs to join us. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Friesen, members of the board. I'm Alice Cooper-Comas, and with Dr. Bakewell-Sachs, co-chair the Covington Implementation Committee. We are here to present you with a progress update on our work, and I will say, we're excited to share with you our progress. As you know, it was a year ago in January that the report was released to the public and to you as a board. We've made significant progress since then. What our presentation doesn't capture is the quality of the work that has happened here. And I think it's really important to note that the quality of the work comes from the process that we've engaged in and how we've engaged the community in it. I think we and the implementation committee certainly feel the same sense of urgency as the community at large feels to get this work done. But it has been really important and transformative, frankly, to do it in this way and gather so much input from our community. So that's not up. Sure. To that one. Thank you. So as you know, many of the recommendations in the Covington report dealt with our policies and procedures. And we undertook a number of those right off the bat with, again, the process that we've described to you, which includes putting together an SBAR or proposal, and then giving that to the oversight committee to review and respond, give us input, and frankly, to reflect not just their input, but the input of the folks that are their stakeholders on that committee. Generally, as we've said before, we have several rounds of feedback, input, and bidirectional exchange with the committee. And so a number of those have moved forward. The discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policy is a big one that has gone through a really major change from what we had before, with many levels of review. It also went to the Policy Advisory Committee, which was a standing body at the university, also to public comment through OHSU Now, where we received public comment and also incorporated those comments into the policy. We're hoping that that will go to the Oversight Committee for their final review here at their next meeting. We're really excited about that. We know that there's still a lot of work to be done there. Once the policy is in effect, we will need a lot of education for our members on what the policy is, what it looks like, what the expectations are for their behavior, reporting, et cetera. So just going into a lot of detail on that one, again, because it's a big part of the work here, and it exemplifies how we've dealt with each of these policies and recommendations, which, as you see at the bottom of the slide, represent 21 of the 45 recommendations in the Covington report.
This slide and the following slide provide a status overview summary of all of the other SBARs. Recall that we have been at about 31 SBARs for the 45 recommendations that were presented in the Covington report. You can see here that several are complete and that many are in progress, with set some point of review between the implementation committee responding to and the oversight committee providing input and feedback on. And this is a continuation of that. And basically you can see that there are several that have not started yet. This represents sequencing often of issues, that certain things need to happen before others do, but we are in the final 5 SBARs in preparation. And, when we think about the work of the past year, yes, that is a really, really wonderful thing to say. But I would really like to reiterate Alice's point that this has really been so much about honoring doing things differently, and that is just a really important point to emphasize.
We wanted to also go through the project status as well. So, the SBARs, the proposals, if you will, are but one portion of the work here. Then we move into actual implementation, and a number of these have have big work behind them in terms of implementing the project itself. And again, and I think we've explained this previously, the project's implementation itself also goes before the Oversight Committee for their review and input. We are learning a lot about what has worked and hasn't worked in the past, both in terms of how we've rolled out education, for example, how people think about reporting channels and how they want to make sure they're accessible. And so getting input at each level has been, again, important for the work moving forward.
So in these next few slides, we are including both the SBAR status, which was in the summary, the overall 2 summary slides, as well as the project status. So in terms of the DEIB vision and strategy, you can see that we are at the second review phase with the Oversight Committee, and the operationalizing aspects of this will begin after that. We have approval of that. Obviously, a necessary sequencing reality of this area of work.
Similarly here, you'll see that we've sequenced some work. So we've realigned the AEO office and that after review from the Oversight Committee that has been completed. Other functions, for example, the centralized HR has been in progress. We, as you know, are lucky to have Ms. Williams joining us, and I know many of the pieces of the Covington report that relate to HR were either in progress, and she has had an opportunity, and we welcomed her insight and input there. As she has rolled out her 30, 60, 90-day strategic plan, it's clear that the Covington issues sort of are highlighted and really focused there. So that work continues, and we again appreciate her insight. The centralized incident management reporting system is, I think, what we've referred to here before as Ethics Point, and it was one of the first pieces that I think came out in the Covington report that felt like we could easily achieve, right? We just needed to expand an existing software system. It's been a really interesting journey here because we've realized the number of inputs that that need to come into the system, the number of data points we want to make sure to capture so that we have appropriate data to present to you as a board and to our community around incidents, and also the number of regulatory bodies that need this information, that the schools need it in different ways, and we want to be sure to both make it accessible for folks who need to report, accessible for folks who have to report, and then that the data provide a level of transparency. So it's really an overhaul of our Ethics Point system as we had it before. That work is really progressing, and there are a ton of people across the university working really hard on what seemed like an easy project, but will take time, and the goal is to be completed with it by the end of the fiscal year.
This slide shows an overview of, again, of the SBARs that relate to hiring, particularly with regard to areas of human resources. You can see that, and I'll reinforce that we have hired our Chief People Officer and additional HR business partners. We're in the process of interviewing for, if you look at the AAEO, moving toward the office and the title of Office of Civil Rights Investigations and Compliance. We are in an interviewing stage for director and intake coordinator, and hope to be able to announce the hiring into those positions soon. And we have hired additional investigators. And these hirings relate to an SBAR's address 4 out of the 45 Covington recommendations.
Here you see a number of additional SBARs that relate to 2 of the 45 recommendations. And as we've talked before, it was not a simple thing of making each recommendation its own SBAR. The complexity of the work has been interesting, and we've really been helped by a lot of good project management and focus on these issues. Again, some of this work is in progress in part because it's we've scheduled it to for example, providing AEO investigator training needed to come after making sure we had the right number of AEO investigators in place. And we continue to, as the slide notes here, analyze what a training has been provided, what the curricula looks like, and what the curricula needs to be in order for us to continue to implement our trauma-informed systems change process.
These would be the final 3 SBARs that are that we have put together on one slide. You will see that, so under the DEIB objectives, as I said, these will begin, the operationalizing will begin once the strategic vision is approved. In terms of reporting on HR metrics, we are very focused on the reporting that we will be able to do going forward with the centralized reporting and data management system. So that will be include additional metrics that we expect to have out of that. So in progress work. And in terms of engagement surveys, planning is underway for a spring, coming later this spring, an employee engagement survey.
This slide shows, again, some complexity with respect to the monitoring for retaliation. It's clear, both in our community and in academia writ large, we see this trend that folks fear reporting because they fear retaliation. And ensuring that people feel safe in doing that is clearly important if we're wanting to change our culture and our institution. And so having the right inputs and assistance for folks who are reporting is important. We are trying to analyze which of those would be best place in order to provide safety to folks. And that's an ongoing process. This would address 3 of the 45 Covington recommendations. And again, it says not started here in terms of the review between the 2 committees, but it's work that is ongoing that we know is important and fundamental, frankly, to a culture change at the institution. So we are happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've taken the training, being a board member for the last number of years. And I remember being confused about all the different channels for reporting and of course the buzzwords and things like that. So I do have a question on one of the slides on the system. I didn't want to interrupt you because you had a really good flow going on. But in terms of, it said 100% done in terms of a centralized incident reporting system, and then 25% done on reducing the complexity. So how can the system be done if the complexity hasn't come out of it yet?
Sure. So the pieces that are done are the SBAR review processes between the implementation and oversight committee. And one of the issues that we worked out as committees between us was how many places would there be for reporting? In other words, will people continue to report to their manager, and what does their manager do with that information? Are people reporting to AEO? What does AEO do with that information? We've determined that all reports, no matter to whom they are made, will be logged into a central incident reporting system that will capture all of the necessary data, both for the Office of Civil Rights Investigations or HR, depending on who's doing an investigation, to have adequate information and to be able to report back to the reporter to let them know what the status is. What's in progress is effectively building the software system that will capture all of that. So those are the 2 pieces.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mr. Paulson.
So tremendous work. I know that there has been a lot of activity, a lot of process, and I do know that we have been very good at being transparent with all the work that we've done so that folks can go out and pull information as they need it to understand what we're doing. My question is, what are we doing, especially as we look at the anniversary of the Covington report? What are we doing to push out information so that they are aware, even if they're not out looking for information, understand all the efforts that we're making and direct them so they can find more information?
I can start. So Hopefully, you know that we have an internal website and a public-facing website where we have all of the information posted. I think in terms of individuals seeing that in a curated way, we had a 6-month report that went out, and we are also working on an anniversary focus on that together. In other words, helping people see the collective. So looking at each individual set of minutes may not give one the total picture. So there have been communications efforts around that. I think with regard to the, and what I hope will really be an opportunity for folks to really capture what has been going on, has to do with the policy work that now comes forward, this 21 of the 45 recommendations that are covered in these SBARs, and the collective focus on a strategic communications effort that is about educating all of our internal members with regard to all of these changes, how these will work, how to pull people in to improve process, and at the same time being able to summarize that to external audiences so that they can really see the this transparency and the improvement overall of what we have achieved.
And what I will add to that, and the Oversight Committee, as you know, I think they presented it previously, came up with a visual tool that tracks progress on the work. We feel it's really important for the Oversight Committee to be in charge of that tool because they can provide input about how far they think we've actually come. And that tool will be updated on a regular basis and be available for folks to look at and track it. Again, Susan's point, it's easier than looking at the minutes of each meeting, which again are available. We want to make sure we are keeping that level of transparency, but people want to see, how far did you actually get in a 1 or 2 slides, and we're providing that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Brar.
First off, thank you to both you guys and your teams for all the work you guys have done engaging the community and, putting these recommendations into SBARs. My kind of question is, in my personal experience, when, I've worked on a project and tried to implement something, there's lots of internal deliberation. We work on it together, go through several iterations. We push a product out and, not always we hit the mark with that first try. And so my question is that into these SBARs, are you guys building in some sort of system where you can iterate on them, take that feedback, and then maybe go again and then come out with a new SBAR or update that system to kind of meet the recommendations to meet the needs of the community?
Absolutely. That is part of our trauma-informed systems change approach iteration. We don't expect that we will get everything right the first time. We expect that we will need to continue to gather feedback as we roll things out. From a policy perspective, it's always been institutional policy. The policies are reviewed on a regular basis. We are looking at the charter for the Policy Advisory Committee, which leads these reviews, both to ensure that policies like these, which we know impact the community in a different way, discrimination harassment policy, for example, is reviewed on a more regular basis than has normally been the case. We're looking at the membership of that committee to ensure it has a really broad set of voices, and also about how we communicate. We normally had a public comment for policy review. We want to make sure we're engaging as broadly the community as we can. So iteration is part of the process and an important part.
Thank you.
I would just add one thing, which is that we have 4 questions that must be addressed for every SBAR. The 4th question is how will this be evaluated and continuously improved? And so on upfront, that has to be thought about in terms of what process would we need to keep this iterative and to remain committed to continuous quality improvement.
Thanks. As you were going through it, my question was going to be, how are we measuring success? And I see the engagement survey coming out. But, as Mr. Paulson indicated, we're coming up to the anniversary of the report. As you've gone through the work, and I know we have the Oversight Committee coming on after you, but how does the pulse of the community come back to the work you're doing, and how does that inform the iterations that Mr. Brar talked about? Because it does take time, and when we say we have these things and they're 100%, we know that culture change is ongoing. So how are we getting the temperature of the community as we implement things and as we make changes?
Well, I really want to defer that question in part to the Oversight Committee chairs, because I think I don't want to speak for the community as broadly as they do. We are trying to make sure that at each turn we are taking in comment, which we know is coming not just from oversight committee members, but from all of their constituents. And we think that has improved the work going forward. So now the stage we're in, drafting new SBARs, take into consideration input that we received in earlier ones. And we are beginning to believe, and we actually had a reflection in our implementation committee last meeting about how it's changing each of our work, even outside the committee for folks who are on the implementation committee, how it's changing, how we do our work, how we take input, who we ask for input is happening. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. Okay. I don't see any other questions, so we will transition to the Oversight Committee. Mr. Alexander and Dr. Orlin Kapuya will join us. I see Mr. Alexander on green.
Yes, we are both here and poised.
Oh, there you go.
Great. Wonderful.
Good to
Well,
see you.
Chair Moncrief, members of the board, and other members of the OHSU community, thank you for being with us today and allowing Dr. Orlin Kapuya and I to provide an update on the work of the Oversight Committee since we had the last opportunity to present to you. Can we move on to the next slide? Great, thank you. I'm not going to read through this, but let me just offer some comments on how we'd like to spend our time today. Dr. Orlin Kapuya will review some accomplishments related to the SBARs that have been shared by our co-chairs in implementation around policy and organizational change and the pathway to transformation that's dictated by the Covington report. And much of that work is focused on the what of that charge. The work of the Oversight Committee is largely to inform the how and the why that complements the work of implementation. The Oversight Committee owns the responsibility for creation of the solutions and the recommendations that are downstream from Covington. We are charged as an Oversight Committee with looking at the adequacy of those recommendations and how they can best reflect the overall sentiments of the larger community. Our co-chairs have outlined the breadth and the depth of what that progress has been. And we are looking at providing input on the 21 recommendations associated with the SBARs on how those accomplishments support the intentionality of the work of the Covington report. We're also in the process of gathering feedback from our members on the past 6 months of our work. And also in getting their sense of what the work looks like going forward. But in the course of our work over the last 6 months, there have been a number of recurring insights that we know are going to inform our path going forward. And Dr. Orlin Kapuya will speak to several of those as we sort of look down the road for this work. Can we move on to the next slide? Before I invite Dr. Orlin Kapuya to lead the remainder of our presentation, I just want to refamiliarize the board, if I could, to the foundational elements of the Oversight Committee and its composition. We are a group of 36 individuals from across a broad spectrum of representation of stakeholders within the organization's within the organization's 12,000 employees. The recommendations that are found in the Covington report charged our group with providing oversight, review, monitoring, and input to the implementation committee in terms of its work from the perspective of its adequacy and accountability. Okay, the committee of 36 is comprised of representation from across the spectrum of representatives of groups, organizations, ERGs, represented and unionized groups, as well as all ERGs, employee resource groups. We additionally have 6 self-nominated members who came from a pool of 186 individuals from the larger community who volunteered to be a part of this work. So as you can see, the filters associated and the composition of this work is very broad and deep, and it's reflective of all of the concerns, the expectations, and quite frankly, the aspirations that exist within the overall community. The committee began its work in February of 2022, and that was after finalizing our charter and into coming to agreement on what we refer to as our community standards. And these are 13 aspirations and affirmations that the group has committed to that will guide our work. All 13 of the standards are of critical importance, but if I was pressed to identify two that I thought stood out, they would be one, that we will prioritize physical and psychological safety in the course of our work. And the second would be that we appreciate the concept of shared expertise, and that's our ability and willingness to learn from and with one another. Early on in our creation, colleagues from the Implementation Committee sat down with us to develop an interactive and a bidirectional framework for how we plan, how we communicate with the Implementation Committee, and how we share information and collaborate. We meet weekly as co-chairs across both committees, and each of us has joined the work session of the other group in order to foster greater transparency and the trust that's really needed to advance this work. And this is in addition to regularly scheduled conference calls with Dr. Jacobs, who has been closely and actively involved with our committees and our co-chair work. And finally, before turning the presentation over to Dr. Marlon Kapoor, if I had to offer a metaphor to frame the bulk of this work on transforming OSHU's organizational hardware, I would say that it is represented by our commitment and fidelity to the principles of trauma-informed practice and policy. That is the software that will allow us to move the what and the how into the reality of how the institution looks to transform and advance its concerns and considerations in response to Covington and its larger aspirations. So with that, what I would like to do is turn the presentation over to my esteemed colleague, and we'll go through the remainder of our slides.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Alexander, and many thanks to Dr. Bakewell-Sachs and to General Counsel Woman Alice. I really appreciated just the flow of our presentations today. I think it's consistent, and as they showed the data and the bars that represents the progress, that progress and those numbers, for each of those numbers and those bars, it represents people, human beings at OHSU who have committed themselves to a process. And what I would say is that they have, while the process and building it has taken time, everyone has appreciated process and appreciated that while things may not be completely perfect, that there's a perfect commitment. And so I'll lead into, if we can go to the next slide, I'll lead into our next slide with this metaphor to kind of talk about what we've done and what we are doing in terms of the work and the community perspective and how important it was to effectively widen, W-I-D-E-N, the bench, to effectively share power and to really in many ways reorient ourselves, to effectively pivot. Because I am from Oregon and we lead in green spaces, I'm going to use the example of cross-laminated timber, CLT, and that cross-laminated timber is just as strong and as effective as steel, but as we know, it has a lower carbon imprint or footprint. And so what we are essentially doing here with this transformation process is taking out the old way of building things and using CLT with the goal of sustainable, right, change over time. that also reduces harm. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what we've accomplished, because we know and have known that, you know, the institution not only committed to just doing and making sure that the recommendations from Covington were completed to fidelity, not just done quickly, but done with intentionality, that there was also a commitment to a trauma-informed systems change process, and that those two things had to go hand in hand. And not only that, but a part of the second half of the work in terms of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work, really the foundation for that work is a trauma-informed floor, which again is being built. So with that, there are a number of things that we've done. The work is getting done, as you've seen, that the trauma-informed framework is essential. It has been core to not just changing hearts and minds, but literally changing and shaping policies for the foreseeable future. That there has been a fierce adherence to this charge, to the charge that was outlined by the charter for oversight. And that meant that this group that has convened the Oversight Committee would consist of multiple experts across the institution in a multidisciplinary fashion to bring the best of what they have to offer to help transform the institution sustainably. That has been done. We've paid attention to all 45 recommendations, and as my esteemed colleagues have shared, it has been a joy to work with the Implementation Committee and a joy to work with our co-chair colleagues. I can tell you that everyone has been intentional, everyone has been thoughtful. The board should have received, if you haven't, we want to make sure that you do get a copy of the visual tool, communications tool. I think there was a question asked by one of the board members about how are we communicating this work. There are multiple modalities that we are looking at that have been in recommendations that have been given to us about the best, most optimal ways to communicate across multiple communities in multiple languages, in multiple modalities. So that accountability tool we want you to look at, but also the visual communication where folks can just get a quick snapshot. If you're not going to the websites, which by the way have everything, every note, every communication that we've had within the context of committees. When we said we were going to be transparent in this process as a core principle to trauma-informed goals, we meant it, and we've acquiesced to that. We are also finding and securing optimal ways of communicating. So a part of when we began to construct the committees, it was important that each of the members or leaders within the Oversight Committee would be poised to communicate with their particular constituents. And that actually was key. We know, and all of the studies show, that the most effective communication is peer communication. When the colleague I work with next to in my cubicle, I'm communicating with that person, and that person is communicating with the other person in group meetings and clinical meetings, over lunch, right? So part of what we have worked to do, and we're still refining, is developing tools and ways to make it easier for all of the members to be able to take the work back and communicate it as clearly and as succinctly and thoughtfully as they want to. And so we are paying attention to that, because this work is important and we are doing it, that it is equally important that it is communicated and received in the way that we want it to be received. And then the committees are working very well together. We have been able to have bidirectional exchange, meaningful, thoughtful exchange. We've seen and bore witness to the integration of feedback that's given. So it's not just feedback is given to Implementation Committee, but we are getting work back that demonstrates and policies back that show that feedback is being integrated. And that's very powerful. And hence you see the progress that we're making. And then I'd also just like to point out that internal support is ever present. We've appreciated being able to spend time with and share space with managers and supervisors to get their strong support by them making space for each of their staff members and faculty to participate wholeheartedly in this oversight process, and they too being open to receiving that information. All of these things have worked in tandem to ensure that we are getting to goal. And again, those bars that you just saw from our Implementation Committee colleagues is a result of all of these things. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just highlight this one important thing and concept. What we know when you look at trauma-informed systems change, there's a lot of data out there, but this is a critical study that shows that there are multiple levels of what it means to be trauma-informed. 2 hours of training, it means that you are trauma-aware. 12 hours of training means that you're trauma-informed. But when an organization makes a commitment to be trauma-informed, it is 18 plus months, a year and a half. And that's just to get to the point where you are comfortable enough and it becomes sort of baked into the culture enough where folks become comfortable with. I think one of the board members asked, well, how have you built in this iterative process? That is very much a part of a trauma-informed process, means that we are always open to making adjustments when we receive new information and as new information comes. It is almost a working assumption that things will change and times will change and conditions will change, which means that the system has to be fluid enough to change with it and open enough to change with it. And that's what it means to be trauma informed. And so essentially, we are 12 months into an 18-month process, which basically it's a lifelong, it doesn't stop here. It doesn't stop at 18 months. It means that there's a firm commitment to learning and unlearning and relearning and undoing and redoing so that we stay steady and we are steadfast in our effort. And the other piece is this consistent application. It's a consistent application of trauma-informed principles. I also we included in the board packets, and it should be available for public review, all of the principles. The trauma-informed principles are good. They're a framework. It's a start, but it is not the way forward. The way forward is an institution putting the meat on the bones of those particular guidelines, which we've done here at OHSU. You have that before you. We went into specific details with what safety looks like in the context of organizational change, what transparency looks like, operationalized. And so I ask that you turn your attention to that. We're not going to have time to go into all of that today, but it is there for your review. And I do hope you review it because it's going to be consistent application of those particular principles over and over again. And this takes practice. This is a practice. This is a commitment. So it's practice, practice. Next slide, please. I think this is our final slide. This is the final slide that we wanted to talk about, is that while we have achieved great success, nothing great comes absent of some of challenge. And so one of the core challenges that we are working to overcome is ensuring that, for instance, I'll give one working example. As we were having conversation about how each of the 36 members would take back the information that they were getting in oversight committee and taking it back to their respective groups, what we discovered is that there are a number together, meaning that we are open to receive this information, is that half of the group felt very comfortable going back to their respective stakeholder or constituent groups. I'm going to move away from the use of the word stakeholder, so take that out of the public record. They went back to their peer groups and their constituents and essentially were able to give that information, exchange ideas, receive information because they had capacity to do that, and they had the experience in doing that. What we've noted in the oversight committee, which is awesome, is that folks are at different levels of leadership, different levels of confidence in their ability to share that information. So some of the work that is unwritten in the charter is creating the conditions for leadership development, helping folks build skills and tools to be able to go back and communicate. It becomes incredibly important. Now, these are many of the members of the oversight committee were selected by their peer group. Their peer group had full confidence in their ability to lead, and we have had the privilege and honor of supporting that being done optimally. So we're finding new ways. We realize that there's opportunities to have greater access to computers for folks who don't normally have access to computers or technology on their regular job. We also, one other thing, mentioned that there's an opportunity to maybe put things in different languages and to let folks know that interpretive services are available and different language services are available if needed. So we're being very intentional. And if we're going to be intentionally inclusive, it means pausing to think about the things that we may not have thought about before. The changes are deep and wide, but haven't been deeply felt because of this piece. But we are working on correcting that And I think this is the next phase of the work. As the work gets done, we have to communicate it, and that'll come with the training. And we are finding new ways to do that daily. So it is a challenge, but we are also overcoming. I think this is the final slide. Next slide, please. I think that we're asking for questions. Oh, this is the final slide. Okay, for real. And I'll go through this quickly. Essentially, the work of the next 6 months is, as you've seen, we've gotten through much of the SBARs. We have about 5 SBARs remaining, or 5 proposals remaining that will tend to all 45 of the recommendations as outlined by Covington. Really, the work of the next 6 months is going to be refining those recommendations. There also needs to, again, we're working on the improved peer-to-peer communication and providing effective tools, and we'll work with strategic communications around that. Communication. We've got websites, but folks aren't going to the websites, so we need to find new ways to ensure that information is right before people in the form. We're thinking of QR codes, everything. And then I think that some of the conversation, and I think Chair Humphreys, you asked about this at our last meeting, and that is, have we given some thought about how this work will continue under sort of a new name, that it's not just Covington, it's the culture work that will continue over time, of course, in the spirit and with the guidance of what has been done here. So I do think some of those conversations will need to be had about what's the next iteration of this work, still having the oversight component very much salient. But we are, again, it has been an honor to do this work. It has come with great reward. Any change process has many things, right? As you begin to move towards truth, the truth will disrupt first before it liberates. But the great hope and what we've seen is that it does liberate. So with that, that is our final slide. We will take any questions with the remaining time that we have. And thank you for the opportunity to share what we're doing and what we've done.
Thank you. Mr. Zika.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent presentation. Wow, I never thought I'd come to a healthcare meeting and we talk about sustainable wood products. So I appreciate the shout out. I will use that as an example though, where architects love to design with wood. The customers really like it. Some of the conservation community is actually okay with using wood products if they're done sustainably. But one of the challenges we've seen in that is change. And both in the first presentation and second, you talked about change. And in the wood products, the builders, the people have to actually put the buildings together. It's different. They don't like it. They like the old way. And why should we do the new way? And so I really appreciate the discussion about change management in terms of how we do the training, because you're going to do all this work and do all this communication, and then people are already busy. People are already doing stuff. Like, how do you practically give people the ability to change? It's not just, I've used the term before, sheep dip training. Boom, I had training and now I'm ready to go. You're going to have to put it into real practical applications where it's just how everybody does their job or comes to work. It really is a challenge. And so I know this whole thing is a challenge, but the actual, unfortunately, harder work is when you're actually going to try and implement all this. So appreciate, because I think both groups did talk about change, and that is really, really hard. So thank you.
Hard, but that's the work of the day, right? We do it because it is hard. And I'll give a quick example. Dr. Duchovny said, and I agree because I've got 3 kids, I used to bake the broccoli right into the lasagna. That the kids don't like the vegetables, but they have to eat it, and so we find a creative way to do that. And I think the way that we are able to have the conversation is we find a way where it's like, okay, we know folks don't really like broccoli, so what can we bake it in? How do we make it easy? Because at the end of the day, we want it to be accessible for folks in the way that they can use it. Because we're inviting, and in many ways, I'm begging folks to join us on this journey, to bring the full of their selves, their thoughts, and to stand in their respective truths. But here's the caveat, with humility, that we all have to do that with humility. There is a way forward. And we are finding that when folks are able to access the information and they taste the lasagna, they're like, oh, this is actually not bad. So, but we've got to at least be able to meet folks where they are. And I think that's that's what we're committed to doing. And I don't think we are expecting it to be easy at all, but it definitely is worth it.
Thank you. I think I want to go back to a question I asked the implementation committee, and I want to thank you all for resetting the oversight committee, because I remember when we were setting these up, I was one that was skeptical, like, wow, that oversight committee is pretty big, got a lot of people, will it be unwieldy? But it's set up as you went through to reflect all of the groups of the institution, right? So every ERG, every program, every mission area. And you mentioned you're having the small forums. In the two presentations, I heard a lot of communication about what we're doing and communicating out. And I think my question before and my question now is, how are we getting the communication in? When we have this oversight committee made up of the number of representatives, I believe the number was 36. When they have the small forums, are we getting the feedback from the constituency on how they're seeing the programs and how we turning that into action? Because what I'm afraid of is we do a survey in the spring and people are saying, well, I heard we're doing this stuff, but I haven't seen it. And I want to make sure we're getting the feedback of people actually living it, feeling we're making progress.
Mr. Alexander, I want to offer to, before I respond to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Chair Marquis, I think those are critical questions, and I think it's two questions. One, the feedback loop is an iterative one. If you look at the process of engagement between oversight and implementation, it is not a one touch and done. It is, what am I hearing? What am I seeing? What do I need to provide by way of enhancing, enriching, or redirecting this recommendation? And it is bi-directional. Many of the details that you saw on the presentation by our colleagues in implementation showed the review of SBARs 2 or 3 times between the two committees that have gone back and forth. And each of those is reflective of inputs that have been provided into oversight that we now share with implementation and say, okay, how does this factor into building this so that we don't have to retrofit it at some point in time? How do we build it from the beginning? The other point that I will share is that this is the beginning of moving perspectives, policies, and thinking that is trauma-informed into the organization. And it is not only designed to affect programs and policies, but culture. How do we engage? You know, there's an expression my father used to use, as you know better, you'll do better. We are learning what it is that we need to know, and how do we now embed that in the organization? And I think that is something that is also going to be a part of the challenge about how do we emerge from this work differently than we went in. And I think, again, that is subject to commitment over time and to embracing, again, as Dr. Marlon Kapoor says, with fidelity, the tenets of trauma-informed practice.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. And just brief, because I know we're at time and I want to be conscious and respectful of that. If we didn't want to get into the weeds today, but if we go back to the process of how information and how and feedback is given, essentially, and the implementation gives the oversight committee the proposal. Each of the oversight committee members review that proposal in tandem with their constituents. So they're sharing that information with their constituents. Their constituents have enough time to get feedback back to them. And the 36 oversight committee members, when they're offering their feedback to us, it is ideally, and I say ideally because this is a process that we are refining, right? That's this leadership development piece and tools. But ideally, that feedback is reflective of the consolidated feedback that they got from their stakeholder group. So it's representative. That's the goal. Now, can that process improve over time? Yes. Have we been able to get that from most of the members at this point? Yes. So that was a part of the challenge and the overcoming is to how to communicate that and get some of that. And then we have folks who just email. You can email. We have an oversight committee email. Folks just email us directly and say, here's our feedback on this. So we've tried to also provide multiple channels, but we're trying to ensure that this peer-to-peer model is working well because we do have an abundance of evidence in literature that suggests that this is the most effective way to move information within a large organization.
And the last thing that I'll add, Dr. Malin-Kapoor, is that that input is codified within an accountability tool that we gather that information. So you can see the iterations over time. This is what we thought in July. This is what we thought in October. This is where we end up in January.
Thank you. That's the answer. I was looking for that in the presentation, and maybe as we go forward and hear from, I heard today a lot of what we're communicating out of what we're doing. I think from a board perspective, and I can't speak for everyone, but I think I've heard this from my fellow board members, is we want to hear the impact it's having on the community. So while yes, we want to push it out, this is what we're doing. We want to hear back how the community is receiving it. They feel we're going down the right path. And I know the survey is one thing, but really the live communication back in to how community is receiving it is what I think the board would love to hear more of. Ms. Byer.
I'll just add to that.
I'm sorry. One last thing. We actually just did a year review as we did a 6-month review, and then we did a year. We're sort of a year review in January. So the board will be getting a report of a summary of that. So I guess when you're saying what's being communicated out, from our perspective, what we've been talking about is everything that's been communicated with the oversight committee. We're not talking about just the public. Our focus, so I just want to be clear about that. We're talking, when we say we're communicating, it's what's being communicated with oversight committee members. And then what they are in turn feel like they are confident enough to communicate or not. But we will have a summary of the 1 year, so you can hear directly. You don't need to hear it from, you can see the words and have the data before you. But what we can tell you in general is that most folks feel like the process, it actually is working, right? We designed a process, it's working, and there's opportunities for this to be a sustainable process over time. I think where we do obviously need to improve is in folks accessing the information in a way that feels palatable or that feels useful to them. So that's the piece that when we say that communications piece, it becomes incredibly salient in this, and it's a focus over the next 6 months. So I just wanted to add that. I'm sorry, Alice, if I can't see you, so count it to my head and not my heart.
Thank you. First of all, I want to second the thanks that others have given to both committees. It's very obvious that you've taken it very seriously, which is very important, that the report was taken seriously. Obvious that you worked very diligently to advance the work, that the recommendations, to address the recommendations. I agree with the communication point. I'd like to add to that and say that I think ultimately what's really going to matter is once we've got all these policies and processes in place, which is what these two committees are addressing, what's really going to matter is what we do about that. And that really probably falls on your shoulders, Ms. Williams. But I think that when you think about what gave rise to the Covington report, it was a series of situations where people felt like there were things going on that weren't right, and they didn't feel like they were being appropriately addressed. And ultimately, we can have the best policies in the world and the best processes in the world, but if we haven't established a really good system of accountability, and that I know the investigators are part of that, which will enhance that, but ultimately it's going to come down to when these circumstances continue to arise, and they will, because everybody's human, right? They will. That's how quickly we act, and it's whether we act in a way that's consistent with these new standards and policies, and that is, I think, what is going to result in the culture change as people feel that is what's happening. And do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think it's a really important point. And, one of the things that I've been saying as I've been bicycling around the organization is that, where we really want to get to is where we're no longer referring to it as the Covington work, right? We're really talking about who we are as an organization, what our culture is, and who we want to be. We're not there yet, but that is the progress that we're making. So the work that both committees just presented to us is getting us there. And then we also have a parallel track that we're working on right now, which is this larger cultural transformation, right? That my team is really spearheading, but it's really going to take everybody to come to the table on. And that's really the message that we've had. Dr. Jacobs has talked about that consistently. He's, talked about, being grateful to have me here, but also knowing that it really is about, everybody putting their hands in and saying, how do we affect this change?
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Moylan Kapuya, Mr. Alexander. We appreciate your efforts. We appreciate the efforts of the committee. We look forward to talking with you further and continuing to advance this work. Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Great.